The advertisement in the Denver newspaper was desperate enough to catch Gideon Grant's attention, even through the fog of whiskey that had become his constant companion since the blizzard took his livestock. Mail order bride needed immediately. Must be willing to endure harsh Wyoming winter. Room and board provided. Respond to Gideon Grant, Loveland, Colorado territory. He hadn't actually placed the advertisement himself. His neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had taken it upon herself after finding him half frozen in his barn 3 weeks ago, muttering about how he couldn't manage another season alone. The old woman had marched into his house, written the words on a scrap of paper, and sent it off before he could protest. Now, sitting in his drafty cabin in November of 1876, Gideon held a single response in his weathered hands. The letter was written in careful script, each word precisely formed as though the writer had labored over every sentence. Dear Mr. Grant, my name is Zara Richardson. I am 23 years old, of sound health and capable disposition. I find myself in need of a new situation, and your advertisement, while unconventional, seems honest. I can cook, clean, mend, and I am not afraid of hard work or cold weather. I have no family remaining and nothing keeping me in Boston. If you are still in need of a wife, I can arrive in Loveland by the end of the month. Respectfully, Zara Richardson. Gideon read the letter 3 times, searching for some hidden meaning or warning sign. At 29, he had given up on the idea of marriage years ago, when Sarah Miller had chosen the banker's son over a struggling rancher. Now his spread, though small, was finally turning profitable, or it had been until the early blizzard killed half his cattle. He needed help. He needed someone to share the burden of keeping the homestead running through the brutal Colorado winter. He needed a wife, even if only in name. He wrote back that same afternoon, his reply brief but sincere. Miss Richardson, I am grateful for your response. I will meet you at the Loveland station on November 28th. I should be honest that this arrangement is born of necessity. My ranch is isolated, the work is hard, and the winter will be long. If you are certain of your decision, I will do my best to provide for you and treat you with respect. Gideon Grant. The 28th of November arrived with clouds heavy as iron. Gideon stood on the platform of the small Loveland station, his Sunday shirt pressed stiff with Mrs. Henderson's iron, his dark hair slicked back with water that had already frozen in the cold air. His hands, rough from years of ranch work, twisted the brim of his hat as the train's whistle echoed across the plains. When Zara Richardson stepped down from the passenger car, Gideon's first thought was that she looked nothing like he had imagined. Tall for a woman, perhaps 5 feet 7 inches, she carried herself with a straight-backed pride that seemed at odds with the worn condition of her traveling dress. Her hair, so dark it was nearly black, was pulled back in a severe bun, but wisps had escaped during the long journey, curling around a face that was all sharp angles and serious eyes. Those eyes, gray as a winter sky, swept over the platform until they found him. Mr. Grant, she asked, her voice carrying a slight rasp as though she had been breathing coal smoke for days. Miss Richardson. He stepped forward, suddenly aware of how large his hands looked as he reached for her single battered trunk. Was the journey tolerable? It was long, she replied, not quite answering his question. She studied him with the same directness she had used to survey the platform, and Gideon felt himself being assessed like livestock at auction. Whatever she saw must have been acceptable because she nodded once. You look like an honest man. That will do. The ride to his ranch took them 2 hours along rutted roads that wound through foothills already dusted with snow. Zara sat beside him on the wagon bench, her back straight despite the jolting ride, her hands folded in her lap. She did not complain about the cold, though her lips slowly turned purple, and Gideon finally stopped to wrap his spare coat around her shoulders. "You should have said something," he muttered, angry at himself for not offering sooner. "I have endured worse," she said simply, but her fingers clutched the coat gratefully. The ranch, when they reached it, consisted of a cabin, a barn, a chicken coop, and several fenced pastures stretching toward the mountains. It was not impressive, but it was solid, built by Gideon's own hands over 5 years of backbreaking work. He watched Zara's face as she took it in, searching for disappointment or regret. "It is remote," she observed. "The nearest neighbor is 3 miles that way." Gideon pointed east. "Town is 2 hours by wagon when the weather is good. In deep winter, we might not make it to Loveland for weeks at a time." "I expected as much." Zara climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his help, stumbling only slightly when her feet hit the frozen ground. "Where should I put my things?" The cabin was divided into 2 rooms. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a large stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. The bedroom was barely large enough for the bed Gideon had built, and a small dresser. He had not thought beyond that when constructing the place, never imagining he would bring a wife here. "You take the bedroom," he said, carrying her trunk inside. "I will sleep out here by the fire." Zara turned to look at him, her gray eyes unreadable. "We are to be married, are we not?" "In name," Gideon said carefully. "I wrote that this was a matter of necessity. I will not force any expectations on you beyond the help I need running this place. You will have privacy and respect." Something flickered across her face, too quick for him to identify. "I see." "And when is this marriage to take place?" "I thought tomorrow, if you are willing. The preacher comes through Loveland on Fridays. We could ride in, make it legal, and be back before dark." "Tomorrow, then." Zara removed her hat, revealing more of that severe dark hair. "I should start supper." "What provisions do you have?" That first night set the pattern for the weeks that followed. Zara proved herself as capable as her letter had promised. She could cook better than Gideon had eaten in years, turning his simple supplies of flour, salt pork, and canned goods into meals that actually had flavor. She cleaned with ruthless efficiency, mended his worn clothes with tiny, precise stitches, and never complained about the primitive conditions or the brutal cold that deepened as November became December. They were married on the 29th in a brief ceremony at the Loveland Church, with Mrs. Henderson and her husband as witnesses. Zara wore the same worn traveling dress, and Gideon wore his Sunday shirt. The preacher seemed unsurprised by the arrangement. Mail-order marriages were common enough in the territories, born of loneliness and necessity in equal measure. "Do you, Gideon Grant, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Do you, Zara Richardson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Her voice was steady, her eyes fixed on some point past the preacher's shoulder. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you man and wife." Gideon had purchased a simple gold band in town, which he slipped onto Zara's finger. Her hands were cold, her fingers long and elegant despite the work roughness already developing on her palms. She looked at the ring for a long moment, turning her hand to catch the light, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. The ride home was quiet. Snow had begun to fall, fat flakes that stuck to the horses' manes and turned the world soft and white. Gideon found himself stealing glances at the woman beside him, his wife now, though she seemed no more familiar than she had when stepping off the train 2 days before. "You do not talk much," Zara said suddenly, startling him. "Never had much practice at it," Gideon admitted. "Living alone makes a man forget how to make conversation. I am not accustomed to it either." Zara pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. The garment had become hers by unspoken agreement. In Boston, I worked as a seamstress. 12 hours a day in a factory, forbidden to speak to the other workers. Silence became a habit. It was the most personal thing she had shared since arriving, and Gideon found himself hungry for more. "What brought you west?" Her jaw tightened. "The factory burned. 40 women died, trapped on the upper floors because the owner had locked the doors to prevent theft. I was fortunate to be on the ground floor that day. I decided I would rather take my chances in the wilderness than spend another day in that city." The starkness of her words hit Gideon like a physical blow. He thought of his own struggles, the hardship of building a ranch from nothing, the loneliness of long winters. But he had always been free, had always had open sky above him and the choice to leave if he wished. Zara had traded one kind of prison for another unknown, trusting the word of a stranger out of sheer desperation. "I am sorry," he said inadequately. "Do not be. I chose to come here. I choose this." She gestured at the snowy landscape, the mountains rising in the distance, the vast emptiness broken only by fence posts and scrub brush. "At least here I can breathe." December brought storms that buried the ranch in snow up to the cabin's windows. Gideon worked from dawn until dark, feeding the surviving cattle, breaking ice on the water troughs, reinforcing the barn against the wind that howled down from the mountains like something alive and angry. Zara worked beside him more often than not, ignoring his protests that she should stay inside where it was warm. "You need help," she said the first time he tried to send her back. "I am capable of providing it. Do not waste time arguing." She learned quickly, adapting to ranch work with the same focused determination she brought to everything. Gideon taught her how to spread hay for the cattle, how to check their hooves for ice buildup, how to spot the signs of frostbite or illness in the herd. She taught herself how to handle the chickens, collecting eggs even in the bitter cold and keeping the birds alive through careful management of their coop's temperature. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Zara mending or knitting while Gideon worked on his account books or repaired tack and tools. The silence between them grew comfortable, broken occasionally by practical discussions about supplies or plans for the next day's work. Gideon found himself noticing small things. The way Zara's face softened when she was concentrating on her needlework, how she hummed under her breath while cooking, the rare smile that appeared when the chickens did something particularly foolish. Christmas arrived with little fanfare. Gideon had never celebrated much, living alone as he had, but he rode into Loveland during a break in the weather and purchased a few oranges from the general store, a luxury he could barely afford. Zara's eyes widened when he presented them on Christmas morning, the first real emotion he had seen from her beyond determination or fatigue. "I have not had an orange since I was a child," she said softly, holding the fruit as though it were made of gold. "My father bought one once before he died. We shared it between the three of us, my mother and I eating slowly to make it last." "What happened to your mother?" Gideon asked, emboldened by the day and the unusual softness in Zara's voice. "Consumption. She lasted 2 years after my father passed. I was 16 when she died, alone in Boston with no family and no prospects beyond factory work." Zara carefully began to peel the orange, her movements precise. "I taught myself to feel nothing about it. Grief was a luxury I could not afford." Gideon understood that more than she probably realized. He had done the same thing when Sarah Miller had rejected him, when his father died leaving him the deed to this land, and little else, when the blizzard killed his cattle and nearly killed him too. Feeling nothing was easier than feeling too much. "You can feel things here," he said quietly. "There is room for it." Zara looked up at him, an orange segment halfway to her mouth, and for a moment something raw and painful crossed her face. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual composure. "Perhaps," was all she said, but she saved half the orange and insisted he share it with her. January tested them both. The storms came one after another, barely allowing time to dig out between each fresh snowfall. Gideon's cattle suffered despite his best efforts, and he lost 3 more cows to the cold. Each loss hurt not just for the financial blow but for the feeling of failure, of not being able to protect what was his. He came in one night, after spending hours in the barn with a sick calf that had died anyway, and simply sat down at the table with his head in his hands. He did not cry, but the weight of exhaustion and defeat pressed down until he could barely breathe. Zara, who had been stirring something on the stove, turned and studied him. Then, without a word, she crossed the room and placed her hands on his shoulders. Her touch was tentative at first, as though she were unsure of the gesture, but then she began to knead the tight muscles of his neck and shoulders with surprising strength. "You cannot save everything," she said quietly. "I learned that in Boston. Sometimes survival is enough." "I brought you here promising I could provide," Gideon said, his voice muffled. "What kind of husband cannot even keep his cattle alive? The kind who is doing his best against forces beyond his control." Zara's hands did not stop their work. "You have kept us alive, kept us warm and fed." "The cattle are animals, Gideon. We are people. There is a difference." It was the first time she had used his given name, and hearing it in her voice did something strange to his chest. He reached up and caught one of her hands, holding it for a moment. Her fingers were rough now, no longer the hands of a seamstress but of a ranch wife. She did not pull away, and they stayed like that for a long moment before Gideon released her and stood. "Thank you," he said, meeting her gray eyes, "for coming here, for staying, for everything." "Where else would I go?" Zara asked, but there was something gentle in her tone that took the edge off the words. February brought a brief thaw, just enough to remind them that winter would not last forever. The sun felt warmer, the wind less vicious, and for a few precious days they could work outside without their faces going numb within minutes. Gideon used the time to assess the damage to his ranch, counting his remaining cattle and calculating what he would need to purchase come spring to rebuild his herd. Zara had begun talking more, sharing small stories from her past or observations about the ranch. She told him about her childhood in Boston, about learning to sew from her mother, about the dreams she had once held of opening her own shop. Those dreams had died along with her mother, crushed under the weight of poverty and the grinding reality of factory work. "What would you do now if you could do anything?" Gideon asked one evening as they sat by the fire. The wind howled outside, but the cabin was warm and the stew she had made filled his belly with contentment. Zara considered the question seriously, her knitting needles pausing. "I think I would do exactly this," she said slowly. "I would have land that was mine or partly mine. I would grow things and raise animals and know that the work of my hands belonged to me. I would never again work in a place where someone could lock the doors and trap me inside." "This land is partly yours now," Gideon said. "You are my wife. What is mine is yours." "In name only," you said. Zara's eyes met his, something questioning in them. "I have not forgotten the terms of our arrangement." Gideon set down the harness he had been oiling, giving her his full attention. "The terms were made out of necessity and ignorance. I did not know you then. I do now, at least somewhat. You work as hard as I do, maybe harder. You have made this place a home instead of just a shelter. If you want this to be a real marriage, Zara, I would not object." The silence that followed was long enough that Gideon began to regret his words. Perhaps He had misread the softness that had grown between them, the way she sometimes touched his hand when passing him his coffee, the way her face brightened when he came in from the cold. "I would need time," Zara finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am not accustomed to being wanted, Gideon. I am not sure I know how to be a wife in the way you mean." "We have time," Gideon said. "All the time you need." March arrived like a promise. The snow began to melt in earnest, revealing the brown grass beneath and the first brave shoots of green near the creek. The cattle that had survived the winter were thin but alive, and Gideon's hope, which had guttered so low in January, began to burn brighter. He and Zara worked together to prepare for spring, cleaning out the barn, repairing fences, planning what they would plant in the small garden plot behind the cabin. They had developed routines and rhythms, moving around each other with an ease born of months of proximity. Zara anticipated what Gideon needed before he asked, and he did the same for her. But there was something else growing too, something neither of them spoke of directly but that colored every interaction. One warm afternoon, as they worked together to clear winter debris from the creek, Zara slipped on the muddy bank. Gideon caught her without thinking, his hands closing around her waist to steady her. She turned in his grip, and suddenly they were face to face, close enough that he could see gold flecks in her gray eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath. "Thank you," she said, but she did not move away. "Zara," Gideon said, her name a question and a statement all at once. She lifted her hand and placed it against his chest, right over his heart. "I am not afraid anymore," she said softly, "or at least not too afraid." Gideon lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. Their lips met gently, tentatively, a first kiss that tasted of new beginnings and melting snow. When they parted, Zara's cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright, and Gideon felt something in his chest that he had thought long dead come roaring back to life. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted, still holding her carefully. "I know," Zara said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I was waiting to see if you would find the courage. You could have kissed me first." "I could have," she agreed, her smile growing. "But I am glad you did it." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Zara did not sleep in the bedroom alone. Gideon held her in his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how right it felt to have her there. They did not consummate the marriage that night, content instead to simply be close, to whisper in the darkness about hopes and fears, and the future spreading before them like the greening plains. The transition from a marriage of convenience to one of genuine affection happened gradually, and then all at once. Gideon found himself looking for excuses to touch Zara, to brush her hair back from her face, to take her hand as they walked. She responded in kind, her reserved nature melting to reveal a woman who was passionate beneath her careful control, who laughed more readily than he had ever imagined, who kissed him with an intensity that left him breathless. April brought rain and wildflowers, and the hard work of spring. Gideon purchased new cattle with the last of his savings, a calculated risk that would either restore his fortunes or break him entirely. Zara planted the garden with seeds she had carefully saved, and others purchased in town, her hands gentle as she pressed each one into the earth. She sang while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, and Gideon found himself stopping just to listen to her voice carrying across the ranch. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Zara leaned her head against Gideon's shoulder with a contentment that needed no words. "I never thought I could be happy," she said quietly. "After everything that happened in Boston, after losing everyone, I thought the capacity for happiness had been burned out of me along with that factory." Gideon wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. And now I think I might be happier than I have ever been in my entire life." She turned to look up at him, her gray eyes soft in the fading light. "You gave me more than just a home for the winter, Gideon. You gave me a reason to believe in tomorrow." "You did the same for me," Gideon said honestly. "I was half dead before you came, just going through the motions. You reminded me what I was working for, gave me something worth protecting." "Worth protecting?" Zara's eyebrows rose. "I can protect myself, thank you very much." "I know you can," Gideon said, grinning, "but that does not mean I do not want to try anyway." May was glorious, all blue skies and warmth after the brutal winter. The cattle fattened on new grass, the garden flourished under Zara's care, and the ranch that had seemed so close to failure began to truly thrive. Gideon's gamble on the new cattle was paying off, and he allowed himself to believe that they might actually make it. Might build something lasting. More than the ranch's success, though, was the deepening connection between him and Zara. They had long since consummated their marriage, discovering in each other a passion that surprised them both. Zara was not the cold, reserved woman she had seemed on that train platform. She was fierce and loving, quick to anger when provoked but quicker to forgiveness, generous with her affection and her trust once it had been earned. She told him one night as they lay tangled together in the darkness that she loved him. The words came out hesitantly, as though she were testing their weight. "I love you," she repeated, stronger this time. "I did not expect to, did not even think myself capable of it anymore, but I do." Gideon's chest felt too small to contain what he felt hearing those words. "I love you too," he said, and it was the truest thing he had ever spoken. "I needed a wife for the winter, Zara. By spring I needed you for my whole life." She kissed him then, deep and sweet, and Gideon knew that whatever hardships might come, they would face them together. The woman who had arrived with nothing but a battered trunk and a heart full of scars had become the center of his entire world. June brought an unexpected visitor. Gideon was working on repairing the barn roof when he saw a rider approaching, and his hand instinctively moved to the rifle he kept nearby. Strangers were rare this far from town, and not all of them had good intentions. As the rider drew closer, though, Gideon relaxed. It was the post rider from Loveland, a young man named Tommy who made the rounds once a month. "Letter for Mrs. Grant," Tommy called out, dismounting. "Came all the way from Boston." Zara had emerged from the garden at the sound of voices, her hands still dirty from transplanting tomato seedlings. She froze when Tommy mentioned Boston, her face going carefully blank in a way Gideon had not seen since those early days. "Thank you, Tommy," Gideon said, taking the letter and pressing a coin into the young man's hand. "Appreciate you bringing it all this way." After Tommy had ridden off, Gideon handed the letter to Zara. She stared at it as though it were a snake, making no move to take it. "I do not know anyone in Boston anymore," she said tightly. "Everyone I knew is dead." "Maybe you should read it anyway," Gideon suggested gently. "Whatever it says, I am here." Zara finally took the letter, her hands shaking slightly as she broke the seal. Her eyes moved across the page, and Gideon watched her face cycle through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been grief or might have been relief. "It is from a lawyer," she said finally, her voice strange. "Representing the estate of my aunt, my mother's sister. I did not even know she existed. My mother never spoke of her family." "What does the lawyer want?" "My aunt died 3 months ago. She left me everything, what little she had. A small house in a town outside Boston and $500. Zara looked up at Gideon, her eyes wide. $500, Gideon. That is more money than I ever thought I would see in my entire life. Gideon's mind immediately went to all the things they could do with $500. They could expand the herd significantly, build a proper barn, maybe even hire help for the heaviest work. But looking at Zara's face, he pushed those thoughts aside. "What do you want to do?" he asked instead. "I do not know." Zara sank down onto the porch steps, still clutching the letter. "Part of me wants to tell them to sell everything and send the money. We could use it here for the ranch. But part of me wonders if I should go back, see this house, understand where my mother came from." The thought of Zara leaving, even temporarily, made Gideon's stomach clench. But he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "If you need to go, I understand. You should know your family's history." Zara looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "My history is here now with you. My mother left Boston for a reason, even if I do not know what it was. I trust her judgment. Tell them to sell the house and send the money. This is my home." The relief Gideon felt was overwhelming, but he tried to keep it from his face. "Are you certain? I do not want you to have regrets." "I am certain." Zara stood and moved to stand in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "I told you I loved you, Gideon. That was not just words. My whole life is here with you on this ranch. I do not need to look backward anymore. I would rather look forward." Gideon pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. Over her shoulder, he could see the ranch stretching out under the summer sun, the cattle grazing peacefully, the garden green and thriving. They had built this together, from nothing but necessity and determination, and eventually, love. The money from Zara's unexpected inheritance arrived in August, and they spent it carefully. Gideon purchased more cattle and 2 good horses, while Zara ordered supplies for expanding her garden and preserving equipment for putting up food for the winter. They also set aside a portion as savings, both of them too familiar with hardship to spend everything at once. With the expansion came more work, but it was good work, the kind that left them tired but satisfied at the end of each day. They hired a young man named Peter to help with the heaviest tasks, a drifter grateful for steady employment and a place to sleep in the barn. Peter was quiet and hardworking, asking no questions about their past and offering little about his own. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. What had been Gideon's struggling homestead was becoming a real operation, one that might actually provide not just survival but prosperity. And through it all, Gideon and Zara grew closer, their love deepening from the passionate urgency of new romance into something steadier and more enduring. September brought cooler nights and the hard work of preparing for winter. This time, though, they approached the task together, as true partners. Zara had learned so much in the month since her arrival, and Gideon trusted her judgment as much as his own. They worked side by side, cutting hay, checking the barn for weak spots, ensuring they had enough firewood to last through whatever the winter might bring. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Zara seemed unusually quiet. Gideon, who had learned to read her moods, asked if something was wrong. "Not wrong," Zara said slowly, "just unexpected." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I am with child, Gideon. The baby should come in April." For a moment, Gideon could not breathe. A baby. Their baby. The idea was so enormous, so transformative that his mind struggled to grasp it. Then joy swept through him like a flash flood, and he let out a whoop that made Zara laugh. "You are happy then?" she asked, smiling at his reaction. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Gideon said, gathering her into his arms and spinning her around before remembering her condition and setting her down carefully. "Are you happy? Are you well? Do you need anything?" "I am happy and well, and I need you to stop worrying," Zara said, touching his face gently. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am strong, Gideon. We will be fine." But Gideon could not help worrying. especially as the stories from town filtered back to him about women who had died in childbirth, about babies lost to fever or accident. The thought of anything happening to Zara was unbearable. She had become so integral to his life that he could not imagine existing without her. "Promise me you will be careful," he said, knowing it was foolish but unable to stop himself. "No heavy lifting, no overworking yourself." "I promise to be reasonable," Zara countered, a smile playing at her lips. "But I will not promise to be useless. I am pregnant, not made of glass." Winter came again, but this time it held no terror for them. The ranch was prepared, the barn was solid, and they had enough supplies to last until spring twice over. More than that, they had each other, and the knowledge of the baby growing in Zara's belly gave them both a reason to embrace the future rather than simply endure it. As the snow piled high and the wind howled, Gideon and Zara spent long evenings by the fire, talking about names and making plans. Gideon built a cradle from oak, carving it carefully and sanding it smooth so no splinter could harm tender skin. Zara sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric, her skilled seamstress fingers creating garments that seemed impossibly small. "What if I am not a good mother?" Zara asked one night, her hand stilling on the little shirt she was hemming. "I barely remember my own mother and I have no experience with children." "You will be wonderful," Gideon said with absolute certainty. "You are patient and kind and fierce when you need to be. Our child will be lucky to have you." "Our child," Zara repeated softly, a smile touching her lips. "I like the sound of that." As Zara's pregnancy progressed, she bloomed. Her face, which had been all sharp angles when she arrived, softened and filled out. She laughed more readily, sang constantly while she worked, and seemed to glow with an inner light that Gideon found mesmerizing. He had never seen anything more beautiful than his wife carrying their child. Christmas that year was a joyful celebration. They had saved one of Gideon's best steers for beef, and Zara prepared a feast that would have impressed any Boston hotel. Mrs. Henderson and her husband came to visit, bringing gifts and congratulations. The older woman took Zara aside for a long conversation about childbirth and motherhood, and Gideon pretended not to notice the way Zara's eyes glistened when she returned. "She reminded me of my own mother," Zara said later, when it was just the two of them again. "I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone older and wiser to guide me." "Mrs. Henderson is a good woman," Gideon agreed. "She will help when the time comes. I already asked her." Zara turned to him, her expression soft. "You think of everything, do you not?" "I try to think of everything that might keep you safe," Gideon corrected, pulling her close. "You are my whole world, Zara, you and this baby." March brought the first signs of spring, and a letter from the lawyer in Boston confirming that Zara's aunt's affairs were fully settled. The last of the money had been sent, along with a few items that had belonged to Zara's mother, packed carefully and shipped west. When Zara opened the box, she found her mother's wedding ring, a Bible with family names written in faded ink, and a daguerreotype of a young woman who looked remarkably like Zara herself. "That is my mother," Zara breathed, touching the image gently. "I do not have any other pictures of her. This is precious beyond measure." They placed the daguerreotype on the mantel, and Gideon often caught Zara looking at it, a small smile on her face. She read through the Bible carefully, discovering names and dates that filled in gaps in her understanding of her family. Her mother had been the youngest of 3 sisters, her father a shopkeeper who had died young. It was not much, but it was more than Zara had known before, and she treasured every scrap of information. April arrived with warmth and wildflowers and, right on schedule, labor pains that woke Zara in the early hours of the morning. Gideon sent Peter racing to town for Mrs. Henderson and the midwife, then stayed with Zara, holding her hand and trying not to show his terror. "This is normal," Zara gasped between contractions, somehow managing to comfort him even in her pain. "Women do this every day." "Not my woman," Gideon said, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "Not you, Mrs. Henderson arrived with the midwife, a capable woman named Margaret who immediately took charge. She shooed Gideon out of the bedroom, but he refused to go farther than the main room, pacing like a caged animal every time Zara cried out. Peter, who had returned from his errand, sat in the corner looking pale and uncomfortable. "First baby?" Mrs. Henderson asked, emerging for hot water. "Yes," Gideon said, his voice rough with fear and exhaustion. "She is doing fine. Strong as an ox, that one. Baby should be here by nightfall." Mrs. Henderson patted his shoulder and returned to the bedroom, closing the door firmly behind her. It was the longest day of Gideon's life. He had faced blizzards and droughts, had broken bones and nursed sick cattle through the night, but nothing had prepared him for the helpless terror of listening to the woman he loved suffer beyond his ability to help. When the baby's cry finally split the air, thin and indignant, Gideon's knees nearly buckled with relief. Mrs. Henderson opened the door, her face creased in a wide smile. "You have a son," she announced. "Big, healthy boy with a good set of lungs. Your wife wants you." Gideon moved into the bedroom on shaking legs. Zara lay propped against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle, and when she pulled back the blanket, Gideon saw his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that squinted against the lamplight. He was perfect. Gideon reached out with one tentative finger and touched the impossibly soft cheek, and something in his chest cracked wide open. "He is beautiful," Gideon whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "You are beautiful. You did so well, Zara." "We did well," Zara corrected, her voice tired but happy. "We made this together, Gideon. Our son." They named him Samuel Grant after Gideon's father. Samuel was a healthy baby, thriving from the start, and Zara proved to be as capable a mother as she was in everything else. The first few weeks were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and the constant demands of a newborn, but Gideon had never been happier. He would wake in the night to find Zara nursing Samuel, moonlight streaming through the window turning them both silver and ethereal, and feel so much love it almost hurt. The ranch continued to flourish. With Peter's help and the good fortune of mild weather, Gideon's herd grew strong. They sold beef in town at good prices, and Zara's garden produced more than they could eat, allowing her to sell preserves and vegetables to the general store. Money, which had always been so tight, began to accumulate in the tin box they kept hidden under a floorboard. As summer ripened into fall, Samuel grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, cheerful baby who smiled at everything and everyone. He had Zara's gray eyes and Gideon's stubborn chin, and both parents doted on him shamelessly. Gideon found himself working harder than ever, driven by the need to provide for his family, to build something that Samuel could inherit and be proud of. One September evening, after Samuel had been put to bed, and the ranch was quiet under a sky full of stars, Gideon and Zara sat on the porch together. It had become their habit this evening time, when they could simply be together without the demands of work or baby pulling them in different directions. "I have been thinking," Zara said, leaning against Gideon's shoulder, "about that first winter when I arrived. What about it?" "You needed a wife for the winter," she said, echoing the words from his proposal letter. "Just for the practical help for survival." "I did," Gideon admitted. "I was half frozen and desperate and not thinking much beyond making it through to spring." And now, Zara tilted her head to look at him, her gray eyes reflecting starlight. "Now I need you for my whole life," Gideon said, the words as true as any vow. "Not just for help or survival, though you provide both. I need you because you are my heart, Zara. You and Samuel, you are why I get up in the morning and why I work until I can barely stand. Everything I do is for you both." Zara's eyes shimmered with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you, Gideon Grant. I loved you by spring, but I think I love you more now, if that is even possible." "It is possible," Gideon assured her, pulling her close. "Because I feel the same way. Every day I love you more than the day before." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Inside, Samuel slept in his cradle, safe and warm and loved beyond measure. The winter that had nearly killed Gideon seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to different people in a different world. The second winter came, but it held no fear for them. They were prepared, prosperous, and together. When the snow fell and the wind howled, they stayed warm by the fire, Samuel playing on a blanket while Zara sewed and Gideon worked on his endless ranch tasks. The isolation that had once been Gideon's greatest hardship became a gift, giving them time as a family without the interference of the outside world. Spring brought renewal again, and with it, news that Zara was expecting their second child. This time, the revelation brought joy without fear. They knew what to expect now, and Zara had proven herself strong enough for anything. Samuel, at a year old, was walking and getting into everything, keeping them both busy and entertained with his explorations. The second baby, a daughter they named Emma after Zara's mother, arrived on a beautiful May morning with much less drama than her brother's birth. She was small and delicate, with Gideon's dark hair and Zara's serious expression, and Samuel was immediately fascinated by his tiny sister. "Baby," he would say, patting Emma's head gently under close supervision. "My baby." "Our baby," Zara would correct, but she looked pleased at Samuel's protective instincts. The years that followed brought both challenges and triumphs. Drought one summer tested their resources, but careful management and their savings saw them through. A harsh winter brought early snow, but their preparations held. Through it all, Gideon and Zara worked as partners, their love deepening with each passing season, each shared hardship, each small victory. They added to the ranch, building a proper barn and expanding the house to include a second bedroom for the children. Peter, who had proven himself invaluable, was given a share in the ranch and became more like family than hired help. Mrs. Henderson remained a frequent visitor, an honorary grandmother to Samuel and Emma. When Samuel was 5 and Emma was 3, Zara gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Daniel and Jacob. The house that had once seemed so empty when Gideon lived alone now rang with the sounds of children playing, laughing, sometimes fighting, always loved. Gideon built onto the house again, adding more bedrooms and a larger kitchen to accommodate their growing family. Money was no longer the desperate concern it had once been. The ranch was successful, providing not just survival but actual prosperity. Gideon could afford to hire additional help during busy seasons, to purchase quality stock, to ensure his children had everything they needed and most of what they wanted. But he never forgot those lean years, never took his good fortune for granted. One evening, when the twins were infants and Samuel and Emma were playing quietly in the corner, Zara looked around the crowded, noisy house and laughed. "What is funny?" Gideon asked, bouncing Jacob gently to soothe his fussing. "I was just remembering that silent factory in Boston," Zara said, shaking her head in wonder. 12 hours a day, forbidden to speak, surrounded by women but utterly alone. If someone had told me then that I would end up here in Colorado, with a husband I love and 4 children making chaos around me, I would never have believed it. "Are you happy?" Gideon asked, though he thought he knew the answer from the glow on her face. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Zara said firmly. "This life, this loud, messy, wonderful life, is everything I never knew I wanted." As the children grew, they each developed their own personalities. Samuel was serious and responsible, often helping his father with ranch work and showing a natural aptitude for handling livestock. Emma was clever and curious, always asking questions and reading every book she could get her hands on. The twins were inseparable, getting into mischief together and laughing at private jokes only they understood. Gideon taught his sons to ride, to rope, to handle the 1,000 tasks required to run a successful ranch. But he also read to them in the evenings, encouraged their questions, and made sure they knew they were loved. He had not had much affection from his own father, and he was determined to give his children something different. Zara taught Emma to sew and cook, but she also taught her to think for herself, to question and wonder and dream. She wanted her daughter to have choices, to never feel trapped the way she had felt in that Boston factory. Emma absorbed everything her mother taught her, both practical skills and harder lessons about strength and survival. The house grew again when Emma was 7, this time adding a proper library room that quickly filled with books purchased from traveling salesmen and mail-order catalogs. Education was important to both Gideon and Zara, who had learned their own lessons the hard way. They wanted their children to have every advantage, every opportunity to make something of themselves. As the years passed, Gideon and Zara grew older together, their hair gaining silver threads, their faces marking the passage of time with lines earned from laughter and hard work. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by shared history and deepened by the life they had built together. Gideon still remembered with perfect clarity the day Zara stepped off that train, all sharp edges and careful reserve. He remembered the desperate loneliness that had driven him to place that advertisement, the practical calculation that marriage would help him survive the winter. What he could never have imagined was how thoroughly this woman would transform his life, how completely he would come to depend on her presence, how deeply he would fall in love. For her part, Zara often thought about the factory fire, about how close she had come to being one of the 40 women who died that day. She thought about the locked doors and the panic, about the desperate leap that had driven her west with nothing but hope and determination. That tragedy had led her here, to this life, to this man, to these children. She could not quite bring herself to be grateful for the fire itself, but she was grateful for where it had ultimately led her. One spring evening, when Samuel was 15 and already working the ranch alongside his father, when Emma was 13 and deep in a book about faraway places, when the twins were 11 and supposedly doing their chores, but probably getting into trouble somewhere, Gideon and Zara took a rare moment alone together. They walked to the top of the hill overlooking the ranch, watching the sun set over the mountains and paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. "You remember your first winter here?" Gideon asked, slipping his arm around Zara's waist. "I remember being cold all the time," Zara said with a laugh. "I remember thinking the wind might actually blow the cabin away. I remember you, so awkward and trying so hard to be honorable." "I was terrified," Gideon admitted. "Terrified of the winter, terrified I had made a terrible mistake bringing a stranger into my life, terrified I would disappoint you." "You never disappointed me," Zara said softly. "Not once in all these years." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their ranch spread out below them. The barn, the expanded house, the fenced pastures full of healthy cattle, the garden that Zara still tended every summer. Beyond the visible structures was everything they had built together. A family, a legacy, a love that had started from nothing and grown into something unshakable. "I needed a wife for the winter," Gideon said quietly, the words familiar between them now. "By spring I needed you for my whole life." "And I needed a new start," Zara replied, completing their private ritual. "By spring I needed you forever." The sun dipped below the horizon, and from the house below they heard Emma calling them for dinner. The twins were arguing about something, their voices carrying on the evening air. Samuel's deeper voice joined the mix, probably trying to restore order. It was the sound of their life, loud and chaotic and perfect. Hand in hand, Gideon and Zara walked down the hill toward the warm light spilling from the windows of their home. The years stretched behind them full of memories, and the years ahead held the promise of grandchildren, of watching their children build their own lives, of growing old together in the place they had made through determination, and love and sheer stubborn will. As they reached the porch, Gideon pulled Zara close and kissed her gently. She kissed him back with the same passion that had surprised them both all those years ago. And Gideon knew that whatever time they had left, however many years or decades, he would spend every moment grateful for the desperate advertisement that had brought this woman into his life. Inside, the children were setting the table, the twins still bickering good-naturedly while Emma rolled her eyes at them and Samuel tried to mediate. It was a normal evening in the Grant household, which meant it was anything but quiet. But it was home, filled with the people who mattered most, and neither Gideon nor Zara would have changed a single thing about it. The story that had started with a lonely rancher facing a brutal winter alone had become the story of a family, of love found in unexpected places, of two broken people who had somehow made each other whole. It was not always easy, but it was always worth it. And as Gideon sat down to dinner, surrounded by his wife and children, the sounds of their laughter filling the room, he knew beyond any doubt that he was the luckiest man alive. Years continued to pass in the rhythm of ranch life. Seasons turned, children grew, the land prospered under careful stewardship. When Samuel turned 18, Gideon began formally teaching him the business side of running the ranch, preparing him to eventually take over. Emma, at 16, announced her intention to become a teacher, and Gideon and Zara supported her dream, arranging for her to attend a teaching college in Denver. The twins, at 14, were still figuring out their paths, but they showed promise as cattlemen, with an intuitive understanding of livestock that reminded Gideon of himself at that age. The house remained full of life and noise, though different as the children matured and began looking toward their own futures. Through it all, Gideon and Zara remained the steady center, their partnership the foundation on which everything else was built. They still took their evening walks when weather and work permitted, still sat by the fire on winter nights, still found moments to simply be together amid the demands of raising a family and running a ranch. When Gideon turned 50, Zara organized a celebration that brought together everyone who had been part of their journey. Mrs. Henderson, now elderly but still sharp as ever, told stories about the early days that made the children laugh and made Gideon and Zara exchange knowing glances. Peter, now a full partner in the ranch with his own small house on the property, raised a toast to the man who had given him a chance when he was just a drifter looking for work. "To Gideon Grant," Peter said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "The best boss, partner, and friend a man could ask for." The gathered friends and neighbors echoed the toast, and Gideon felt Zara's hand slip into his. He looked down at her, at the woman who had transformed his life so completely, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Later, after the guests had departed and the children were in bed, Gideon and Zara sat on the porch under a sky full of stars. It was a warm summer night, the kind that made Colorado seem like paradise, and the sounds of the ranch settling for the night created a peaceful backdrop. 50 years old, Gideon mused. When did that happen? Gradually and then all at once, Zara said with a smile. She was 44 now, still beautiful in Gideon's eyes, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined but full of character. Do you have any regrets? Only one, Gideon said seriously, and when Zara looked up sharply, he grinned. I regret that it took me so long to find you. I wish I had placed that advertisement years earlier. Mrs. Henderson placed the advertisement, Zara reminded him, laughing. You were too stubborn to do it yourself. True enough, Gideon admitted. I should send her a thank you note every year on the anniversary. I think she knows, Zara said, settling more comfortably against his side. She tells everyone in town that she is responsible for our happiness. I heard her at the general store last month, taking full credit for our marriage. She has earned the right, Gideon said generously. Without her interference, I might have frozen to death that winter, alone and miserable. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only came from years of deep understanding. Gideon thought about that first winter, how desperate and hopeless everything had seemed. He thought about Zara stepping off the train, a stranger willing to risk everything on the word of a man she had never met. He thought about the slow transformation from strangers to companions to lovers to partners, the gradual building of trust and affection into something unshakable. Do you ever think about Boston? Gideon asked suddenly. About what your life might have been if the factory had not burned. Zara was quiet for a moment, considering. Sometimes, she admitted, but not with longing. That life was killing me slowly, grinding away everything that made me who I am. The fire, horrible as it was, set me free. It brought me here to you, to this life. I would not trade any of it, not for anything. The summer passed into fall and fall into winter again. The cycle continued, reliable as sunrise, marking time in harvests and snows and new calves each spring. Emma left for college, bringing tears to Zara's eyes and a feeling of emptiness to the house that took weeks to adjust to. But she came home for holidays full of stories about her studies and her dreams, and they were all proud of her determination and intelligence. Samuel, at 20, began courting a neighboring rancher's daughter, a sensible young woman named Catherine who impressed both Gideon and Zara with her competence and kind nature. The courtship was proper and careful, but anyone could see the affection between them. Gideon recognized the look in his son's eyes, because he saw the same thing in his own reflection when he looked at Zara. The twins, now 16, were growing into fine young men, though they still got into occasional mischief that kept everyone on their toes. They had their father's build and their mother's sharp minds, a combination that served them well in both ranch work and their studies. The ranch continued to prosper, now one of the most successful operations in the area. Gideon's reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock had spread, and he could command good prices for his cattle. The tin box under the floorboard had long since been replaced by an actual bank account in town, with enough money to ensure comfort for years to come. But despite their success, Gideon and Zara never lost sight of where they had started. They remembered the desperate winters, the times when every penny counted, the fear of failure that had driven them both. Those memories kept them humble and generous, quick to help neighbors in need and fair in all their dealings. when Samuel married Catherine in the spring of 1895. The wedding was held at the ranch, with guests coming from miles around to celebrate. It was a beautiful day, warm and clear, and Gideon could not help but think back to his own wedding nearly 20 years earlier. That brief ceremony in town with just 2 witnesses seemed a lifetime ago, a different world entirely. As he walked Samuel to meet his bride, Gideon felt the weight of time passing, of one generation making way for the next. But it was a good feeling, a sense of continuity and legacy. His son would build his own life, make his own family, continue the work that Gideon had started so long ago. Zara cried during the ceremony, happy tears that she did not bother to hide. Emma, home from college for the occasion, stood beside her mother and held her hand. The twins, dressed in their Sunday best and trying to look solemn, kept grinning at each other. It was a perfect day, full of love and promise and the sense that everything was exactly as it should be. That night, after the guests had departed, and the house had finally quieted, Gideon found Zara standing on the porch, looking out over the ranch in the moonlight. "Our son is married," she said wonderingly. "When did he grow up?" "Gradually and then all at once," Gideon said, echoing her words from years before. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and she leaned back against him with a contented sigh. "We did well with him," Zara said. "With all of them." "We did," Gideon agreed. "They are good children growing into good adults. That is all any parent can hope for." "Samuel looks at Catherine the way you look at me," Zara observed softly. "He loves her truly." "He learned from the best example," Gideon said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "He watched us for 20 years. He knows what real love looks like." The following year brought the birth of Gideon and Zara's first grandchild, a boy that Samuel and Catherine named Gideon Jr. Holding the tiny infant, Gideon felt the circle complete itself in a way he had not anticipated. He thought about his own father, gone these many years, and wondered if the old man had felt this same overwhelming surge of hope and fear and love when Gideon himself was born. "You are a grandfather now," Zara teased gently, watching him cradle the baby with exquisite care. "Does that make you feel old?" "It makes me feel blessed," Gideon said honestly. "To live long enough to see my children have children of their own, that is a gift many men do not receive." Emma graduated from teaching college and took a position at the Loveland School, staying close to home rather than seeking opportunities in Denver or further east. She boarded in town during the school week, but came home most weekends, filling the house with her presence and her stories about her students. The twins, at 18, showed no inclination to leave the ranch. They worked alongside their father and brother, learning every aspect of the operation and showing innovation in improving efficiency and livestock management. Gideon found himself relying on them more as his own body began to show the effects of decades of hard labor. His hands, which had once been so strong and sure, now ached on cold mornings. His back, which had carried countless loads of hay and wrestled stubborn cattle, protested when he pushed too hard. Zara noticed before he said anything, of course, and began insisting he rest more, delegate more, accept his limitations. "I am not an invalid," Gideon protested one evening, frustrated by his body's betrayal. "No one said you were," Zara replied calmly, not looking up from her knitting. She was making a blanket for their second grandchild, recently born to Samuel and Catherine. "But you have worked hard for 30 years, Gideon. You have earned the right to slow down a little." "Slowing down feels like giving up," Gideon admitted, voicing the fear that kept him pushing past his limits. Zara set down her knitting and came to sit beside him, taking his weathered hands in hers. "Slowing down is not giving up. It is accepting the natural order of things. You have sons who are capable of carrying on the work. Let them. Take pride in what you have built, in what you are passing on to them." Looking into her eyes, Gideon saw the same sharp intelligence, the same fierce determination that had drawn him to her all those years ago. But he also saw the silver in her hair, the lines around her eyes, the subtle signs that they were both growing older. Time spared no one, not even the woman who seemed invincible to him. "You are right," he said finally, bringing her hands to his lips. "As you usually are." "Always," Zara corrected with a smile. "I am always right." The transition was gradual. Gideon took on more of a supervisory role, making decisions but leaving the heavy physical work to his sons. Samuel, now the father of 3 with another on the way, had grown into a capable rancher in his own right. The twins, at 20, showed every sign of continuing the family tradition. Peter, though growing older himself, remained a steady presence, training the next generation with the same patience Gideon had shown him years ago. Gideon found that retirement, or semi-retirement at least, had its pleasures. He had more time to spend with Zara, more time to play with his grandchildren, more time to simply sit and enjoy the view he had worked so hard to build. The ranch continued to thrive under the combined management of his sons, and Gideon felt pride in knowing that his legacy would continue long after he was gone. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Gideon surprised Zara with a trip to Denver. They stayed in a proper hotel, ate at restaurants, and attended a play at the new Opera House. For 3 days they were not ranchers or parents or grandparents, just a man and a woman celebrating a quarter-century of marriage. "This is lovely," Zara said on their last evening as they prepared for bed in their hotel room. "But I will be glad to go home tomorrow." "Missing the ranch?" Gideon asked, already knowing the answer. "Missing our life," Zara corrected. "Denver is exciting, but it is not home. Home is that drafty cabin that we have added onto so many times it barely resembles the original. Home is the porch where we watch the sunset. Home is the land we have worked and the family we have raised. Home is wherever you are," Gideon said, pulling her close. "That has always been true for me." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, their bodies knowing each other so well that words were unnecessary. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Gideon felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Zara murmured, already half asleep. "For stepping off that train. For taking a chance on a desperate stranger. For building this life with me. For everything." Zara shifted to look at him, her gray eyes serious in the dim light. "I should be thanking you. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me a family when I was alone. You gave me love when I thought myself incapable of feeling it. You gave me everything, Gideon." "We gave each other everything," Gideon corrected. "That is what love does." The years continued their steady march. Emma married one of the teachers from her school, a kind man named Robert who treated her like she was precious beyond measure. They settled in Loveland, and soon Emma was expecting their first child, adding another generation to the family tree. The twins, now in their 20s, showed no interest in marrying despite their mother's gentle encouragement. They were content with ranch life, with their close bond to each other, and seemed in no hurry to change their circumstances. Gideon suspected that would change eventually, but he did not push. Each person had their own timeline. Samuel's family grew to include 6 children, ranging from 10-year-old Gideon Jr. down to baby Martha. The ranch house rang with the sounds of grandchildren during holidays and family gatherings, and Gideon and Zara found themselves at the center of a sprawling, noisy, loving family that seemed to grow larger every year. On Gideon's 60th birthday, The entire family gathered for a celebration that rivaled his 50th. But this time, grandchildren outnumbered adults, and the noise level reflected that reality. Gideon sat in his favorite chair, a grandchild on each knee, and felt a satisfaction deeper than anything he had ever known. "Happy?" Zara asked, settling into the chair beside him with baby Martha in her arms. "Beyond measure," Gideon said honestly. "I never imagined anything like this when I was young. I thought I would live and die alone on this ranch, just another forgotten homesteader who tried and failed to make something of himself." "But you succeeded," Zara pointed out, gesturing at the crowded room. "Look at what you built. Look at this family, this legacy. You succeeded beyond anything you could have imagined." "We succeeded," Gideon corrected, reaching over to take her hand. "None of this would exist without you, Zara. You know that." She squeezed his hand gently, her eyes suspiciously bright. "We make a good team." "The best team," Gideon agreed. As the party continued around them, children playing and adults talking, Gideon allowed himself to drift into memory. He thought about that first terrible winter, facing the cold and isolation alone. He thought about the advertisement he had not wanted to place, the desperate measure that had seemed like admitting defeat. He thought about Zara stepping off the train, all sharp edges and wounded pride, trusting a stranger because she had no other choice. What had started as necessity had transformed into the greatest blessing of his life. The wife he had needed for the winter had become the partner he needed for his whole life, the mother of his children, the grandmother of his grandchildren, the steady center around which everything else revolved. "I love you," he said to Zara, the words as necessary as breathing. "I love you too," she replied, the response automatic but no less sincere for its familiarity. The evening wound down eventually, as all evenings did. Children were gathered and taken home, dishes were washed, the house slowly emptied until it was just Gideon and Zara again. They sat on the porch in their usual spot, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "You remember what you said in that first letter?" Zara asked suddenly. "About needing a wife for the winter. I remember everything about those early days," Gideon said. "They are burned into my memory." "I thought it was such a strange thing to say," Zara continued. "Just for the winter, as though I were a seasonal hired hand to be dismissed come spring." "I was an idiot," Gideon said flatly, scared and desperate and not thinking clearly about what I was really asking. "But by spring," Zara said softly, "everything had changed." "By spring, I needed you for my whole life," Gideon finished, the familiar words settling between them like a prayer. "I have needed you every day since." "And I have needed you," Zara replied, "more than I ever thought possible to need another person." They sat in peaceful silence, hands intertwined, hearts beating in familiar rhythm. The ranch spread out before them in the darkness, the land they had worked and worried over and eventually made their own. Inside the house, in frames on the mantel, were photographs of children and grandchildren, the visible proof of lives well lived and love freely given. As Gideon approached his later years, he never took a single day for granted. He had learned too well how quickly things could change, how thin the line between survival and disaster could be. But with Zara beside him, he faced each day with confidence, knowing that whatever came, they would face it together. Their lives settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings were spent tending to light chores and playing with grandchildren who visited. Afternoons found them reading or working on small projects, Zara with her knitting and Gideon with his whittling. Evenings were for sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, talking or simply being together in comfortable silence. The ranch thrived under Samuel and the twins' management, growing and evolving but never losing the foundation that Gideon and Zara had laid. New buildings went up, new innovations were implemented, but the core remained the same: honest work, fair dealing, and a commitment to family and land. When Gideon turned 65, he officially signed over the ranch to his sons, keeping only the house and a small portion of land for himself and Zara. It was time, he knew, to fully step aside and let the next generation take the lead. The decision brought relief rather than regret, a sense of completion rather than ending. "We built something good," he told Zara that night as they celebrated quietly with just the immediate family. "Something that will last." "We did," Zara agreed, her hand resting on his arm. "And now we get to enjoy watching it continue without the weight of responsibility on our shoulders." Their later years were sweet, filled with the pleasures of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, of watching their family tree spread and flourish. Emma's children grew alongside Samuel's, and the twins eventually did marry, adding even more branches to the family. The ranch house that had once seemed so empty now overflowed regularly with family gatherings that spanned 3 generations. Gideon's health, while generally good, showed the inevitable decline of age. He moved slower, tired more easily, needed help with tasks that would once have been simple. But Zara was always there, her own body showing the marks of time but her spirit as fierce and strong as ever. They took care of each other with the practiced ease of long partnership, anticipating needs and providing comfort without need for discussion. On their 35th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party that brought together seemingly everyone they had ever known. The ranch was filled with people, tables groaning under the weight of food, children running everywhere creating cheerful chaos. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 90s and confined to a wheeled chair, presided over the festivities like a queen, still taking credit for bringing Gideon and Zara together all those years ago. As the celebration wound down and the guests departed, Gideon and Zara found themselves alone once more on their beloved porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in familiar glory, and the mountains stood eternal and unchanging against the horizon. 35 years, Zara marveled. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Gideon said, pulling her closer. His body ached from the long day, but his heart was full to bursting. "Sometimes I still see you as you were on that train platform, all sharp edges and careful reserve. Other times I cannot remember a moment when you were not beside me." "We have lived a lifetime together," Zara said softly. "Several lifetimes, really. We have been so many versions of ourselves, grown and changed so much, but always together." "Always together," Gideon echoed. "That is the important part." As darkness fell and the stars emerged, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other and memories and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. The desperate rancher and the factory girl from Boston had built something remarkable, something that would echo through generations long after they were gone. Inside the house, safely stored in a trunk, were letters and photographs and mementos of their shared history. Gideon's original advertisement for a wife, Zara's careful response, the train ticket that had brought her west, her mother's daguerreotype and Bible, the deed to the ranch, birth certificates and wedding announcements, and all the small pieces of paper that marked the passage of their years. But the real legacy was not in documents or possessions. It was in the land they had nurtured, the children they had raised, the love they had built from nothing more than necessity and determination, and the willingness to take a chance on a stranger. It was in the family that gathered around them, in the grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward, in the great-grandchildren just beginning their own journeys. As Gideon held Zara close under the stars, he thought about how close he had come to a very different fate. If Mrs. Henderson had not placed that advertisement, if Zara had not responded, if either of them had chosen differently at any of a dozen critical moments. The thought was sobering, a reminder of how much of life came down to chance and choice in equal measure. "What are you thinking about?" Zara asked, her voice drowsy but content. "About how lucky I am," Gideon said honestly. "About how everything could have been different. About how grateful I am that it was not." "I am grateful too," Zara murmured, snuggling closer. "For all of it, even the hard parts, because they led us here." They sat in peaceful silence as the night deepened around them, two people who had found in each other everything they had never known they needed. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and pine. From the barn came the soft sounds of horses settling for the night. Above them, the vast Colorado sky stretched infinite and beautiful, the same sky that had watched over them through all their years together. Eventually, though neither wanted to break the spell, the cold drove them inside. They prepared for bed with the comfortable routine of long marriage, Gideon banking the fire while Zara closed the curtains, both moving through the familiar rhythms without need for coordination. In bed, Zara curled against Gideon's side, her head on his shoulder, their bodies fitting together the way they had for decades. Sleep came easily these days, one of the few gifts of age, but before he drifted off, Gideon pressed a kiss to Zara's forehead. "I love you," he whispered, the words as necessary as prayer. "I love you too," she replied, already half asleep, "always and forever." As Gideon closed his eyes, he knew with absolute certainty that he had lived a good life, more than good, blessed beyond measure. He had needed a wife for the winter, that brutal season that had nearly broken him. By spring, he had needed Zara for his whole life. And now, as the years drew toward their inevitable conclusion, he still needed her, still loved her, still found in her presence everything that made life worth living. The ranch would continue after they were gone. Their children would carry on the work. Their grandchildren would inherit the land. Their great-grandchildren would build on the foundation laid so long ago. But the true legacy was not in the ranch itself, but in the love that had built it, the partnership that had sustained it, the family that had flourished within it. As sleep claimed him, Gideon's last conscious thought was one of gratitude. For Zara, for their life together, for every moment from that first desperate winter to this peaceful night. He had been blessed beyond anything he could have imagined, loved beyond anything he deserved, given more than he could ever repay. And tomorrow, if he was lucky enough to wake to another day, he would get to do it all over again. He would wake with Zara beside him, would sit with her over morning coffee, would spend another day in the life they had built together. It was a simple joy, but it was everything. In the darkness of their bedroom, holding the woman who had transformed his existence, Gideon Grant knew peace. The journey that had started with such desperation had led to such abundance. The arrangement born of necessity had become the greatest love story he could have imagined. And though the years were racing past faster than he liked, though his body was failing and time was running short, he had no regrets. He had needed a wife for the winter. By spring, he had needed her for his whole life. And that was exactly what they had built together, a whole life, full and rich and overflowing with love. It was more than enough. It was everything.